Let's turn that off. Okay. So I live in Venice, and every day when I go out for my walk or I drive to the market or I go wherever I have to go, I see so many homeless encampments, people who don't have houses, people walking with no place to go. And it is just the most horrible humanitarian crisis I think we have in our city, bar none. I noticed that an encampment on the beach, people were moved into supportive and temporary housing, and the encampments get filled up again. It is just unending and the saddest thing. Many people here and I have gone to local community meetings about this with our elected officials, people who are trying really, really hard to do something about this. And we are met with loud, angry NIMBY neighbors shouting at these people trying to get the job done. It's just, it's horrible. So this is why I am so interested and glad that we are working this year towards this issue of housing and what to do about it. And why we have called this program the Torah of Home, which you'll learn more about as the evening goes on. We have power to make change. ECAR has 960 households. That is the biggest number we've had in all the years of credentials. And we work in partnership with LA Voice, which is a multi-faith, multicultural community organization representing 60 diverse churches, synagogues, and mosques, and organizations representing about 40,000 Angelenos. More people, more power. And as members of LA Voice, we are also members of PICO, California, which is currently organizing in 75% of the state's Senate and Assembly districts. And it's comprised of 480 interfaith congregations, schools, and neighborhood institutions, representing over 450,000 families. So as we proceed this evening, we'll look at our path and what we're doing and use our power to make change. And that's it.
Thanks so much for that, Jody.
You're welcome.
So now I'm going to turn it over to Hannah, who is going to teach us some Torah.
Thanks, Adam. Hi, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Great to be with you. It feels like it's been forever. I guess it has. That's why it feels like it's been forever. But great to see you all. Okay, so we are going to talk some Torah as we do. Are you serious, Brooke? Brooke just said in the chat that we are over 1,000 families now. Okay, need a second to process that. Wow. Amazing. Okay, Melissa, it's like increasing as we talk. By the end of the meeting, it's going to be 3,000. So get ready. Okay, so we're going to talk a little Torah as we are wont to do here, and as I especially am wont to do. As many of you know, I like to talk about the Parsha, and that's what we're going to do. So first, let's situate ourselves. You can just unmute yourself or raise your hand. Can someone tell us what book of the Torah we're in? I think this might be an easy question. Sometimes it's tricky, but I think right now we can do it. I think we can do it.
Genesis, Bereshit.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone. Amazing. Wow. So much good knowledge in this group. Okay. And what's happened so far? Just throw out some stories that you've heard the last few weeks. If you don't know, also great. But if you have a sense of maybe you've been at shul or you read the Parsha or you just know what happens at the beginning of the Torah, we're at the very beginning. So just throw out some stories, some ideas. What have we heard? Okay, Janet says, we lech lechad. Thank you, Janet. And also very relevant because lech lecha was last week's Parsha. So someone is paying a lot of attention. Thank you, Janet. Love it. Anyone else? Other things that have happened? Okay, great. We're going to wait 30 more seconds. See if anyone else can think of any early Genesis stories for us.
the world was created.
Oh, let's start there. Excellent. Thank you, Marcia. Yes, great. Okay, the world was created. Great.
And
Cain killed Abel, his brother. Excellent. Also, Janet says Rabbi Kasher has a great podcast, which is true. That's a really good plug for Rabbi Kasher's new podcast, Best Book Ever. Highly recommend. Also, a great way to know what book of the Torah we're in and what parsha, because he'll let you know. 15 minutes a week. It's great for the soul. Okay, Adam says God created the world, then was like, JK, I don't like it. Gonna drown it and start over, but I like that Noah guy, he can live. That's pretty much it. That's the parsha. You could do Rabbi Kasher's podcast in 30 seconds instead of 15 minutes. We should do another version. And then Leah says we've been expelled, had a murder and a flood and a deal with Abraham, Garden of Eden. Great. Now we're really on a roll. Now people are getting back into their Torah brains and hearts. I love to see it. Great. Okay. All of this is true. So that's a lot of what's been happening. These early chapters of Genesis are kind of crazy in how much happens. The fact that all of those stories have happened and we're only in the 4th parsha of this book. And this book has 12 parshas in it. So we are barely a third of the way through Genesis, and all of that has already happened. And there's so much more to come, which is just some of the weird craziness of this time in the Torah. Later in the Torah, we won't get as many stories so early, and we're only like 20 chapters into Genesis or something like that. So there's a lot to come. There's a lot going on. And someone mentioned Lech Lecha, and someone mentioned God making a kind of deal with Abraham. And so that's where we've changed our story. So we had Noah, and then Lech Lecha is the beginning of Abraham's story. So we got that last week. And then this week in Parshat Vayera, we're continuing Abraham's story. So I'm going to ask you another question, which is about Abraham. So feel free to write things in the chat or just unmute yourself or raise your hand. What do you know about Abraham? What stories do you know about him? What do you think of when you hear his name? Maybe the answer is, I don't know what you're talking about, which is great. Put that in the chat too. And then I'll know that I should give a little more context. What do you know about Abraham? What feelings do you have about him? Yeah, Leah.
I love him.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
great.
I don't like to hear anything bad about him. That's what I'll say first. He is, the legend has it that he destroyed all the idols in his father's shop and was taken to trial for that and found guilty. Well, he was guilty and thrown into a fire and actually survived the fire. That's the beginning of him for me.
That's the midrash. Yeah. I want to just clarify. It's not in the Torah, but yeah, there is a midrash about it. Amazing. Okay. So we have one big Abraham fan. Okay. There may be some detractors, so you have to prepare yourself, Leah, but great. Sarah, did you want to say something? Sarah Greenberg. Yeah, sorry, there are probably multiple.
It's Sarah.
Oh, Sarah, sorry.
That's okay. I think of Sarah and Hagar. That's what comes to mind when I think of Abraham.
Yes, Sarah and Hagar. Excellent. Let's check what's happening in the chat. Beth says, welcoming dude. Great. Janet says, left his home for a land he didn't know. Mark and Michelle, he was a warrior, a patriarch, a risk taker, fathered 2 sons with important roles in our history. Very succinct, helpful summary there. Thank you. Tony says he was asked to sacrifice both of his sons, an extreme test of faith. Yes. Sarah, a mother of nations. Great. Anyone else thoughts about Abraham? Those are a lot of great ones so far. Anyone else thinking about Abraham? What are you holding? Oh, Esra. Wow, so glad you're here. Great to see you. Esra says, argued with Hashem on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah. Oh my gosh, how'd you know? We're on our way there. Okay, great. Final thoughts about Abraham. Stories, feelings, love, hatred. Esra likes that. Okay, great. Maybe she's in the Leah camp of loves Abraham, doesn't want to hear anything negative about him. He circumcised himself. Yes. Let's maybe not end on that one, but we can. Lived 175 years. Excellent, excellent, excellent. There's so much knowledge here. We can hold him in both loving and critical regard. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Okay, just there's so much to be said. Okay, there's a lot going on with Abraham. If that wasn't clear from all of these additions so far, he's a complicated guy. He lives a long time. There's a lot to happen in that kind of lifetime. And to go to what Leah said, he's a pretty incredible guy in a lot of ways. He's our first ancestor. We are all here because of him. He's the one who gets the first covenant with God, and everything starts there. And we end up here all of these thousands of years later. And I want to talk briefly just about Abraham as a justice warrior. What kind of justice work was Abraham doing? And yeah, totally what Anita's saying. He was multi-layered like most humans. And tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about some of his finer moments and see if we can channel him a little bit. And the first thing I want to start with is, I think, the moment where he most actively seems to be seeking justice, which is what Esra mentioned, which is that he fights against God about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. We don't have enough time to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah right now, but these cities were full of a lot of evil and hatred, and God decided to destroy them. And Abraham challenged God and said, wait, you're going to destroy all of these cities because there's some evil? What if you found 50 people who weren't evil? Then would you destroy the whole city? And God said, okay, no. If I found 50 people, I wouldn't destroy it. Okay. And then he says, what about 45? What about 40? What about 30? He goes all the way down to, I believe it's all the way to 20, to 10 people, to fight back against God, to say, you can't destroy everyone when there's this much evil or even this much evil. And he really argues with God in a way that we haven't seen anyone do up to this point. We just had the Noah story, which is kind of the opposite, where God says, I'm destroying the world, but you're saved, build an ark for yourself. And Noah says, no problem, happy to do that. So this is kind of the antithesis of that. We have this person who's really fighting on behalf of all these people who live in these cities that Abraham doesn't even live in. He's just conscious of the fact that something isn't right with the idea of destroying this whole area because apparently there's evil when there isn't really a lot of clarity about what's going on there. And so we can look to him there in some ways as one of our models of justice work, that sometimes you have to scream and yell and challenge authority and bring all of these arguments and cases before the powers that be, and do it on your own or do it with a few other people and feel really vulnerable and work really hard to have your voice heard and really pray and hope and try so hard to have that be received. And that's one model of work that we do here too, that we really sometimes have to be banging on doors and yelling at people to just listen. And the other thing that we see with Abraham that I think we usually don't talk about in this way, but I think is really relevant, is his welcoming. The story about the way that he welcomes people, I want to talk about as an act of justice. And someone mentioned it, Beth mentioned it in the chat earlier, that he's a welcoming dude. And that is one of the things we say a lot about him and about his wife, Sarah, is that they were welcoming, which who really knows what that means, but we get the story, the most iconic story of their welcoming in this week's Parsha Vayera at the beginning, which is that God appears in some form and these three men show up outside of their tent, outside of Abraham and Sarah's tent. And Abraham doesn't know these people. They just came from nowhere. We don't know who they are. We don't know anything about them. And he ran from the tent. And people remind you that this happened right after he was circumcised, and he was a pretty old person at this point. And he ran out to greet these men. He bowed before them. He said, don't go past me. Don't keep going. Let me bring you water. Let me bathe your feet. Recline under this tree. Let me bring bread for you. Let me do all these things, and then you can keep going. And he goes inside and he tells Sarah, prepare all these things where you have to make sure that these people are really well rested and fed before their journey continues. And then they get to continue their journey. And I want to think about what this means, what this kind of radical welcoming means as a way of understanding justice. that what we're talking about tonight and so much of our work right now is on houselessness and homelessness and people who don't have a space to be. They don't have a tent. They can't bring bread to the people who are visiting them. They can't rush out and welcome them in these ways. And so what is it to see someone who is passing through in some capacity, whatever that means, and to go out of your way, not to acknowledge them, not to say, I see you, but to say, let me make you like me. We're the same thing. Let me bathe. Let me make sure that you can bathe. Let me wash your feet. Let me cook for you. Let me give you water before you continue. That in all of us is the same humanity. And how can we see that welcoming, not just as welcoming, but as justice? That his work was to say, I don't know you and I don't know your story, but I see you and I see that you aren't settled. There's something unsettled about this journey that you're on. And how can I make myself of service to you? And so I just offer those two versions of Abraham tonight for us to think about the moments where we're called to be loud and to be in the streets and banging on legislators' doors, and the moments where we're called to just open our hearts and ourselves and remember that we're all the same thing.
Yasher Koach. That was amazing and inspiring, and I'm really glad that we're all taking that into this work and the rest of the meeting. So thank you so much, Hannah. We are fortunate enough to be joined tonight by Tommy Newman, who is the VP of Engagement and Activation for the United Way, and he runs the Everyone In campaign. And Tommy is, we've been collecting questions from all of you for about homelessness in LA as we think about how can we learn about this as we move into what we're going to do about that. And we're fortunate enough to have Tommy here to answer some of those questions, or try to answer some of those questions. They're big questions tonight. And Brooke is going, I'm going to hand it over to Brooke, who is going to be speaking with Tommy on your behalf. And I'm hoping we're going to have time to open up to questions to everybody again.
Hi, everyone. So glad to see you all here. Tommy, thank you so much for joining us. So many of you will recognize Tommy because he's been with us before. As the leader of the Everyone In campaign, Tommy was our expert who came and spoke with us about the bill we worked on in the last session of the legislature, SB 679, the La Casa bill, which unfortunately, despite all of our best efforts and Tommy's truly heroic efforts, did not pass in this session. But hope springs eternal, and we hope to be working on more legislation in the future that will address this massive crisis that we have here in Los Angeles and across the state. So Tommy, as you've heard, we asked our community to share with us over the course of the High Holy Days, what were their questions about housing and homelessness? What were the things that they were uncertain about that perhaps they'd wanted to ask somebody and hadn't had a chance? And of course, you came to mind as the person we would like to bring in to talk about that with us. So I'm going to just quickly ask Sarah, if you would mind just spotlighting so folks can see Tommy and maybe me, that'll make it easier for everyone to follow along. So Tommy, we've collected these questions, and my role will just be to share them with you and ask you to share with us your thoughts on these, and hopefully we'll get through them. And then if there's time, we'll get to some more questions people might have. So first off, for so many of us in our community, I think there's the big picture question of how did we get to this crisis point? And obviously that is a long answer question that I'm asking you, but if you had to name just a few of the major factors, how would you begin to explain how did we get here? And then particularly what impact has the pandemic had on the situation that we now face?
That's a great framing question to start. So you picked a good one to get going here, and it's great to see everybody again. I just love this group, and I saw Sarah the other day at an event, and I was remarking on I don't know of any other group where 44 people show up after 7 o'clock to talk about all things policy. So you are a special bunch. How did we get here? We got here by having a highly fragmented governance system that was designed to perpetuate segregation of races, and no consistent funding source for housing for low-income people, because I think we talked about this quite a bit the last time I was here. It's lo and behold, people who don't have a lot of money don't have a lot of money and can't pay rents that people who have more money than have. And so unless you figure out how to inject some cash into that equation, then you segregate where people live and you squeeze them, and we lo and behold come the most overcrowded housing market in the United States of America. Overcrowded meaning multiple families living in a single dwelling unit. So yeah, it was like partly intentional over many years. You know, the earliest days of, you know, the 20s to the 60s in California, and then we passed a Fair Housing Act in California, but it was never really enforced, and we never came up with dedicated money. I was talking with somebody at Policy Link this morning, actually. She was in Washington, D.C., and they're thinking about a big investment that they want to make in California, which would be good. And she was like, "What? Give me the case for why we should do it in LA." And my answer was because despite being the third wealthiest metropolitan area in the world, we don't have any of the things that all of the other big metros have in terms of money, public development corporations, inclusionary zoning policies. Like New York has like New York City has like 4 different entities designed to do affordable housing. Not saying they're perfect. We have basically none. So that would be my opening answer, to say many, many years of intentional and unintentional neglect and racism gets us to where we are today.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. Can you just add on top of all that stuff, the COVID crisis and how that's impacted what people see on the streets in the last year and a half?
Yeah, I mean, a few things. As it relates to visible homelessness, so I'll distinguish two components. COVID and the impact in low-income families is that overcrowding thing, right? When you have 2 or 3 families living in a 2-bedroom apartment and one family gets COVID, how can you isolate, right? You can't have a family of 4 staying in one room. So that happened over and over and over again. And we have people at United Way who live in multi-generational families crammed into 2-bedroom apartments, and everybody got it. So the overcrowding thing, like we are more overcrowded than New York, and it's been hidden. It's been sort of, it doesn't look like tenements. It looks like a 2-bedroom apartment with 3 families living in it. So that's how it sort of impacted hundreds of thousands of people through the course of the pandemic, and still continues to be a deep risk there. As it relates to unsheltered homelessness, here's something I'll say that I think is counterintuitive. While unsheltered homelessness looks worse than it ever has before, it's basically because the city of LA stopped doing any of the stuff that it did before the pandemic hit. So they stopped doing regular cleanups, many of which are good things, right? Like not all cleanups are bad. Some of them are deeply disruptive and triggering of trauma and erode trust that is built. So that's why we all, voice our concern when we start seeing the Joe Buscaino approach to clean it up, because we know it's not that simple. But some of the cleaning up is good and helpful, right? When people are living outside, and to know that somebody can come and pick up their trash once a week, that's helpful. And their service providers support that, advocates support that. The city basically stopped doing all of that for like a year and just let everything spiral out of control. That's a good question, Janet. We'll get in that. So that's why it looks worse. I actually predict that homelessness will be down when we do the next homeless count, because at the same time that the city stopped doing any of the things that make homelessness look less terrible, there was actually a massive infusion of cash in terms of hotel rentals, hotel motel acquisitions, short-term housing support, eviction moratoriums, rental support. Like there was a massive infusion of state and federal cash to support low-income renters and people experiencing homelessness that we've never had before, like in this country. I mean, one of the reasons why the rental assistance program has been such a mess is because we've never really done this in a large way. So all of a sudden you're asking all these levels of government to do something we've never done. So I would predict, and I hope everybody volunteers at the homeless count in January, and then we'll hear next May. I actually predict that the homeless count, the total number will be lower because of the massive infusion of federal dollars.
Mm-hmm. So I think for some people who don't have the background in this that you do, we need to go to this kind of some of the basic questions. Like, can you talk about how large a role mental health and addiction play in the current crisis?
Yes. I want to get to the HHH one. So I looked at the questions earlier today, but I can't remember if there's something in there. So if there's not, we should add that to the list.
Yep.
Mental health, based on the homeless count from 2 years ago and based on relatively consistent data over many years, people with serious mental illness, which is different than any mental illness, but people with a serious mental illness, also known as SMI, generally make up about a quarter of the people experiencing homelessness, the total number of people experiencing homelessness. But I said that once in front of a room of 180 LAPD officers, and they started like booing me and heckling me. And I said, I know that that's not your experience, right? Like, people don't call the LAPD usually for somebody who's quietly living in their RV in Reseda. They call the LAPD when somebody's having a mental health crisis on the sidewalk. So what we perceive and what we see is different than the whole. It always is, right? We as human beings always sort of draw from anecdotes and apply to the whole. So the majority of people do not have serious mental illness who are out there, but certainly the folks that we see in crisis where we're just shocked and stunned that this could be happening is the sort of manifestation of that. Our Department of Mental Health is just, saying it honestly, not well equipped to deal with people who are having mental health crises on the streets. We're starting to make a little progress. Like, there's going to be a number that people can call. That's a clinical term, serious mental illness. So just Google it and you'll get a good definition. I don't want to screw it up. But our Department of Mental Health has historically not been well equipped to figure out how to connect with somebody who's in, a full psychotic episode on the streets and then be able to like bring them in. It's not as much about the laws. I mean, the laws are a part of it, but that's a little bit of like a crutch that we rely on because it's really hard, right? Like, it's a really hard thing to do. And so I think the DMH is trying to get better. There will be a number soon that people can call. I think it's 811 that people can call if they see somebody who's having a mental health crisis and need DMH support. That's progress. That's good. Increasing the number of acute psychiatric beds. That's a good thing. Those are increasing. We're seeing more of those. But when Ronald Reagan closed the sort of centralized old way of doing things, the idea was that board and care facilities would replace those, and those are community-based, but they're still, a locked door or some high level of services and regular medication and food. But the board and care reimbursement rate, like the nightly rate that somebody gets for a board and care is nowhere close to what it takes to operate a board and care. And so they've all been closing. That is something that I would put on y'all's list as you're thinking about your next round of priorities, because people with serious mental illness, there is not a good system. And it's something that people stay away from because mental illness has so much stigma in this country. It's something that people sort of throw their hands up and say, I don't know what to do. So there's not a lot of accountability or advocacy out there on it. And it would be as simple as increasing the board and care nightly reimbursement rate would have a transformative effect to stop losing those beds and having a place for somebody to go when they're having a psychotic episode and then are stabilized and then need somewhere to go. I mean, don't forget, we were using and continue to use LA County Jail as basically our solution for people who are having mental health crises on the street. That crazy stat, on average, 40% of the people in LA County Jail are people who are having some sort of mental health breakdown. That's not what a county jail is supposed to be for. And that's why United Way works so hard on Measure J and why we continue to fight for it, even though the system is pushing back.
Yeah. Folks, there's great questions coming up here in the chat. I want to try to get to those, but I also have a list of questions that people submitted in advance. So just so you know, I see those and I hope to get to them as time allows. So Tommy, can you talk to us about the idea of service resistance, right? This narrative that many people are offered services and refuse them. Why do they do that? And how common is that really?
Not that common. Not that common at all, actually. You know, if you were to talk to an outreach worker, you know, they would say maybe 15%. That's a number I heard within the last 6 months. 15% of the people who are out there don't want to come indoors and don't want to talk to anybody, which means that 85% of people would love to come indoors as soon as possible, right? So like, let's not focus on the 15 when there are 85 out there who would really love to come indoors if there was somewhere safe and high quality for people to come indoors. You know, I think the fact that there are 40,000 people who have completed the survey that outreach workers have and are entered into the system, that thing called coordinated entry system, which is really just a tool to not have 85 different databases, but have one database. And that was something that the United Way piloted with the support of a lot of foundations in town a decade ago, and now Measure H has taken to scale. There are 40,000 people who are in that database who have answered all the questions and said, if there's housing, I'd love it. And so let's focus on them and bring them indoors. And if you talk to outreach workers, they'll tell you that even the people who aren't ready that day just aren't ready yet, but that day will come. You know, I think that story of that the Times had the other day about people experiencing homelessness getting the shot, and some of them having said no to the outreach worker, you know, 20 times, but then for whatever reason, that day was the day. Maybe it was a gift card, maybe it was something else. Yeah, service resistance is a crutch that I think some folks use to absolve our own selves of responsibility for the part that we play in not finding solutions.
Yeah. So let's talk about building housing. Why is it so expensive to build affordable housing? Why does it take so long? And why haven't we seen a greater impact or a more immediate impact from HHH, which I know that that you and I both do a lot of work to try to help make happen.
That's right. And okay, so I'll do a little bit more on HHH consistent with the other question. So there's over 1,000 HHH units that are now opened. I think there's 3,800 units that are under construction, and we're approaching 8,000 units. Yeah, we're approaching 8,000 units that have a funding commitment total, with each one of those being a subset of the whole. That's a lot of units. That's more units in the last 5 years than the 35 years prior that we did in the city of LA. So I just, you know, we have lost the battle on HHH being a success or a failure. I accept that we have lost that battle, and I will not be able to persuade the masses that it's actually done a lot of good stuff. And of course it could be better, but we've done more now in the last 5 years than in the previous 3 decades. I accept. There are a lot of people who don't accept that and are very bitter about it, but I'm not a bitter person. So I accept that, and then we'll figure out how to move forward. Because that's what we got to do, right? We have to figure out how to keep doing it at that scale because we didn't do it for decades. Why do the units cost so much? There's 1,000 that are open, there's 3,800 that are under construction, and there's approaching 8,000 total that have been given a funding commitment. And our goal was 10,000. And I still think we'll get there. There's about 180. I mean, the loss of housing is a huge component of that, right? Like that loss is critical. Don't forget, the 10,000 goal is not like an actual goal. It's a goal that we as advocates externally created and then said it over and over again. And then the LA Times started saying it. But if you go to City Hall, the first thing they'll always say is, we never committed to 10,000 units. We said we were going to get as many as we could. And so it's just the power of advocacy that we sort of built that into the narrative, and we should never forget the power of that. So why does it cost so much? It costs so much for a bunch of reasons. It costs so much, yes, because there are higher labor costs, because policy has decided that when we use public money, we should pay people more than whatever you know, a construction worker makes as a market average. We can decide here that that's bad, and we want to pay construction workers whatever the market supports, or we can decide that we accept that and the 15 to 30% increase in cost associated with those wages is worth it. That's sort of that's a policy choice. So that's a big piece, but it's not the only piece, actually. One of the second largest cost driver is the number of funding sources that a building needs. So when a regular developer, there might be some developers on the line who could certainly correct me if I get this wrong, since I'm not a developer, but when a regular developer wants to build an apartment building, they go get a construction loan, and then they build the building, and then the construction loan converts to a permanent loan and is paid back by the rents from the people who live in the building, and the developer makes a profit, right? One loan, build the thing. When a affordable housing developer tries to build a building, they need on average 8 different loans to build the building, because nobody wants to pay for the whole building. The city of LA doesn't want to pay for the whole building. State doesn't want to pay for the whole building. Fed don't want to pay for any buildings because the Fed stopped doing that a long time ago. So what we've created is this system where you get a little bit of money from the city and a little bit of money from the state and a little bit of money from the tax credits. And each one of those has their own rules and their own timeline. And they are the thing that makes it take 5 years to build a building. And so the consequence, and the Turner Center at Berkeley has done a great job. You should, if you haven't poked around on the Turner, T-E-R-N-E-R, if you haven't poked around on the Turner Center's website at Berkeley, you should, because they analyze all this stuff. And they basically say that anywhere that each funding source adds 2% of cost. So if you get to 10 funding sources, do the math, right? Like, because of the time where you're holding the land and sitting on it, because of the different rules that apply, because of the soft costs related to lawyers and consultants and everybody else to line up the loans. So we have a terrible funding approach to affordable housing that drives up the cost, which is one of the reasons why we were so glad to work with all of you on SB 679, because our intention there was to create something that could be a single source of money, that it could roll up dollars, it could have enough of its own capital, and it could go be that single source and reduce the cost of buildings by, you know, anywhere between 10 and 20%. So those are the 2 biggest costs. Then we put a bunch of sustainability requirements on there. Again, important things as the world burns around us. But those increased costs, those are not, you know, somebody who's building a regular apartment building does not have the same level of sustainability requirements that affordable housing does. So we've layered on a bunch of policy stuff, and then we've created the, like, how can I put as little money into the building as possible? Even now, if you go to the city of LA, this is my last point and then I'll stop. If you go to the city of LA and you say the building costs $550,000, the city of LA response is not like, oh, you're right, that's a lot of money, we should figure out how to get that down. The city of LA's response is, well, only 120,000 of it is HHH money. Isn't that great? And on the one hand, some people say, yeah, that's good. Look at, you're leveraging it, you know, 4.5 times. But if we were to really were to stop for a minute, we would say, ooh, in the short term, that's good. In the long term, we might be shooting ourselves in the foot.
So I'm going to try to roll together a couple of other questions here. So I think what you're leading into is a good overview of the complications of financing affordable housing. First, for our folks who are brand new to all this, can you give people a sense, like, for most projects in LA, what's the percentage of financing that comes from different levels of government or from the private sector? And for an individual project, what might that look like?
Well, I would say there's probably 2 buckets to think of here. There's 100% affordable housing. Oh yeah, here Joel makes a point that I think is fair. This is the 2 buckets I'm gonna talk about a little bit. There's 100% affordable housing, which the market is not incentivized to build and does not build because you can't make money off of poor people. But then there is the other strategy, which we're doing more and more of, and is super relevant here, which is getting percentages of buildings to be affordable and using all private money to make that happen. So here in the city of LA, we have this thing called the Transit-Oriented Communities Program, where a building can be anywhere between 8 and like 18%, depending, affordable, with 0 public money required. And that's a great thing. And it works well. And I think we've cleared 2,000 units of that
I think I froze.
type of affordable housing. You're still good.
Okay.
And that's good. The problem is, just think of how many total units, your numerator and denominator, just think of how many total units you need if 8 to 18% of the building is affordable. to get to the hundreds of thousands of units that we are short. It's like millions of units, which is hard for us to pull off. But that's a really valid way, and those units cost less because there's less public policy requirements placed on them, and don't cost any public money, which is a good thing. On the 100% affordable, the other bucket, and I'm looking at Joel's comment now, you know, I think we struggled to figure out, first of all, I do think that cost is a little too low, Joel, if we're not talking about land costs here or on-site utilities. The cost of because we've done United Way has launched an affordable housing initiative, and our goal is to raise $50 million to do 10 buildings of interesting new typologies, shared housing, modular housing, small buildings. So we're doing that all now. And, you know, some of those really low per unit costs back out things that cost money, like land and site prep. It's also really hard to finance the modular stuff because we can't get lenders to do it, because in the traditional build a building, you get chunks of money as you hit milestones. You pour the foundation, you get a chunk of money. You frame it with wood, you get a chunk of money. But in modular, they build the whole thing and then they drive it to the site and they put it on. And so it's like, there's a lot of risk there for lenders. And so it's been actually harder to finance than people have realized. The point's taken that there should be alternative ways of doing this. I don't dispute that for a second, Joel. And I also think that it was a real missed opportunity to not think of HHH as one big project, 10,000 units of the same type of housing for the same type of people, because we could have bought 10,000 bathrooms and divvied those out across the buildings. We could have used standard designs, right? Like every building should not be a unicorn completely unlike all of the others. That doesn't mean that they all need to be a box with no personality. But I think that's a calibration and something we talked about with La Casa, SB 679. How do we do economies of scale better when it comes to housing? I've lost track of the question, but
yeah, so
I'm sure you'll bring me back.
So Tommy, let me bring us back to the new typologies. Where are you on the scale of optimistic to pessimistic about whether some of these new typologies are going to actually get to scale in Los Angeles, and whether they're going to bring down costs, and whether you think that that this is the way we're going to be going in the future? So the prefabricated, and people are talking about like 3D printing houses and shipping containers and all that stuff. Prefab.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm just generally an optimistic person. So I always think that where there's a will, there's a way. I think the key questions are financeability. So how much risk is there associated with a thing? What are the hurdles? And operational viability. Like those are two really critical questions. Modular is something that like exists in Europe a lot. They've just figured out how to finance it and insure it and permit it in ways that we have never tried here. Right now, we're very close with Gensler, and Gensler's been trying to do, it's a big architecture firm here in town and around the world. And Gensler's been trying to do modular stuff. And they've kind of like said, it's not that cost and time competitive as compared to stick built for now. But there's ways to push past that. So I think it's real. I also think that shared housing, individual room with their own bathroom, and then a shared common space with kitchen, which is what our first building that we've financed through our affordable housing initiative, is also, I think, really promising. And what's exciting about that is it's on a small lot. It's 50 feet wide by 150 feet deep, which is not usually the type of lot you can use in the tax credit model. And so there's a lot of those lots in town. So we can't just keep doing the same type of building. I absolutely think it's promising. We just need to incentivize it more.
Okay, let's talk about those like little lots where we could maybe put something. So lots of people in our community are asking, there's an abandoned lot in my neighborhood or an empty building. Why isn't that being used for housing? So can you talk about what are some of the obstacles that are preventing sites like that from being redeveloped for housing?
Tony and I were just emailing about this recently, and talking about zoning and money, right? Like what's allowed to be on a site, and then what's the money that exists for a given type of housing on that site. So those are the two issues. So if you have a lot in your neighborhood, maybe it's zoned for housing, maybe it's not. That's one set of questions, something that we've all been talking about. And then, assuming it is zoned for housing, because a lot of them, you can build housing on commercial land, for example, in the city of Los Angeles. So generally speaking, you can do housing. Housing is a math equation. How much does it cost to build the thing and operate it? And what's your revenue coming in? And like, you've got to be able to line those things up. And really low income people don't have a lot of money. So that means there's not a lot coming in, which means it doesn't pencil, which means you can't borrow a loan, which means you need subsidies from some sort to make it pencil. And so it comes down to that every time. We shouldn't overcomplicate it. Like even the money part, and this is why we went so hard at SB 679, the money part is more important than the zoning part. Because where the zoning part, like there's a lot of land out there. And thanks to a lot of the state laws passed, zoning is changing. The issue is, do we have either rent subsidies or capital subsidies? Those are your two money levers for low-income people living in those buildings. And we don't have enough of it. And so that's why we don't see it getting built that much.
Let's talk about parking. Does parking add a significant cost to building affordable housing right now?
Yeah. It adds a significant cost to everything. I mean, a developer will tell you a parking spot costs between $30,000 and $60,000. So that cost has to get factored into something. Yeah, like that per unit cost thing is, you know, there's a lot of things that go into a per unit cost that have nothing to do with the unit. I would say we have made progress on reducing parking requirements for 100% affordable housing. So thanks to the supportive housing ordinance that we passed in the city of LA that a lot of us worked on together, and then AB 2162 at the state level, which sort of expands that, we've reduced parking requirements pretty significantly for supportive and affordable housing. We've made good progress on that, but it's undeniably expensive, and I don't think it's the best use of money.
Mm-hmm. So can you talk about why there's so much resistance to affordable housing and permanent supportive housing being built in neighborhoods? And perhaps
this is my
more
nice to be a contrarian. I don't think there's that much resistance anymore. I guess this is why I'm just here to say things that don't square with conventional wisdom. I had that quote in one of Doug Smith's stories about HHH. When we passed the bond, everybody was like, oh, I don't even think they'll be able to build one unit of this because everybody's going to fight it. Well, there's 1,000 units under construction and 3,800, 1,000 opened and 3,800 under construction and 8,000 financed. Like, I don't think that it's actually as big of an issue as people make it out to be anymore. I think that there is pretty significant opposition to shelters, temporary housing, bridge housing. Those are all similar things. There is pretty significant opposition there, I think. But you're always going to have a small number of people who are complaining about something, but like they're not representative of the whole. And we've gotten a ton of these units going all over the place. I think the bigger challenge is money. I don't think, we also took away a bunch of the tools, like that supportive housing ordinance that I was talking about exempted supportive housing from CEQA. And so now a local group cannot use the California Environmental Quality Act to prevent a building from being built. So we took away their primary tool, which was very satisfying. It might be my most satisfying thing I will end up doing in my career. I don't think it's as big of an issue. I think it's an easy sort of goat to blame, but I don't think it's actually that big of a challenge. Which is one of the reasons, last point, why we really pivoted away from it on Everyone In. Remember in Everyone In the early days, it was like site fights, like show up at this meeting and battle it out against the people who don't want it. We kind of stopped doing that because we passed some laws that made it harder for them to actually stop it other than shouting at a meeting, but who cares? And we also decided we had better things to do with our lives, like try to get more money and pass bigger policies, and the HHH stuff seemed to be moving forward.
Well, that's an interesting take on it, and news to me, and positively so. So thank you for giving me something to feel optimistic about tonight.
That's what I'm here for.
Thank you. So Okay, so here's another question. Why are we not seeing more short-term solutions like safe camping on vacant lots while permanent solutions are built? Why do some housing advocates seem to oppose short-term solutions?
First of all, I don't think that all of us, broadly speaking, as advocates, don't want short-term places where people can go. So I would distinguish between types of solutions, right? Like, there's nobody fighting against acquiring motels and turning them into bridge housing. There's nobody saying no more shelter, right? It was so I would just start by saying, like, we are not opposed to shelter. I don't know anybody who's opposed to shelter. We do need a balanced system, right? Like, we don't want to end up like New York, which has 90,000 people sleeping in shelter beds every night who are permanently stuck in shelter. You need to have places where people can go. And so just because I'm not out here the evangelist for shelter beds doesn't mean that we don't support them. I'm just trying to create the places where people can go, because I don't think that anybody should live in a shelter bed for the rest of their lives. Now, that being said, there are different types of short-term housing. And I think that it is emotionally appealing and seems logical that safe sleeping, on a parking lot in a painted box, or tiny homes, we should have 100,000 of them. Like, I get it. I would fully support that if money was unlimited. But money is not unlimited, and all of that stuff is really expensive. Like, the safe sleeping is $70 a night, $2,100 a month. Why can't we just collateralize that $2,100 a month and turn it into a master lease and lease a building, and then somebody could be sleeping in a 400 square foot studio apartment instead of on an asphalt parking lot? So that would be my argument. There are people who obviously make the other argument. The city of LA is certainly pushing in that direction. At the end of the day, like, there are trailers. There are trailers in South LA that came from the state of California. Those cost $220 a night to operate if you add up all of the operating costs. The propane, the pumping out of the individual raw sewage from each of them, the power, the utilities, all of it. So, like, just because something looks like it should be cheap and fast doesn't mean that it's cheap and fast. And there's a cost to putting dollars into that as compared to master leasing apartment buildings, which are actual homes and housing. So that would just be the balance, I would say. Like, let's not, and I've said this on the record, I said it in an interview with KCRW a few weeks ago, that, like, nobody's opposed to short-term housing. We know we need it, but let's not pretend like it's that much cheaper and that much faster and that much easier.
Yeah. Okay, so here's another sort of zooming out question from the chat. Can you describe some of the gradations of homelessness? So, people on the street, people who are in shelter or transitional housing, boarding care, permanent supportive housing. Can you sort of break down the categories?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to think of it is that, like, something between 2/3 and 3/4 of the people experiencing homelessness are experiencing it because of an economic reason. Loss of a job, the amount of money they make from a job doesn't support the cost of rent, something like that, economic reasons. And then the balance are chronically homeless because of some complicated set of life experiences and morbid conditions and health and just really complex, right? So I would start there. And whether somebody's living outside or whether somebody's living inside, like, generally that's been consistent for like almost a decade from the homeless counts and what we've learned through lots of research.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the question is, what are the solutions for those two universes of people? And the solution is that for the 2/3 to 3/4, it's a place they can afford. And for the balance, it is probably something like supportive housing, which is an apartment that somebody can afford combined with on-site supportive services. It could be varying degrees. It could be board and care. It could be PSH, which is different than board and care. And I saw the comment about board and care. I mean, board and cares are certainly not perfect, and they've been so deeply underfunded that they're not great. I'm not going to pretend like they're great, but the concept is the right one. It could be higher level skilled nursing. Right now, what we're seeing, here's an interesting anecdote. What we're hearing from a lot of the supportive housing operators, who are, some of those who are doing the 1,000 units of HHH, is that they have people who are over the age of 65 who are getting moved into these buildings, and those people need to be in a skilled nursing facility, right? The highest level of care. But that doesn't exist for destitute people at the scale we need, right? And I'm sure anybody who's had experience with their parents or anything else knows what that's like. And so we're taking people who should have 24/7 nursing support and moving them into an apartment where in theory they can make their own meals and bathe themselves. So that is just a really complex component of the work. Those are the biggest cost drivers. Those are the folks that we see on the streets who are in the worst shape. That's the challenge that, as we have not taken care of our seniors, continues to be a huge issue. But I would sort of keep it that simple. And when you don't have enough places for people to go, then you end up with 75% of the people experiencing homelessness living outside, which is where we are in LA, and there's a really high unsheltered percentage.
Can you talk about what percentage of folks experience houselessness are like runaway youth or other marginalized groups like trans folks, not documented, people caught up in human trafficking?
Those are good stats. I mean, those are good questions. We don't have a ton of great stats on that. We haven't done a homeless count in 2 years, first of all. That's a big piece. And then the research on it isn't great. So off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you trans or undocumented is minuscule. I mean, undocumented folks are generally living in severely overcrowded housing, but paying $50 to $100 a month to live with 8 other people in a 1-bedroom apartment. That's where undocumented folks are, broadly speaking. Youth homelessness, I'll look it up while we're here because I don't want to quote you wrong. I should have looked that one in advance. It's meaningful. I mean, the number of, I think 40% of all foster youth will experience homelessness at some point in their life. So it's significant, to be sure. I'll look it up in between questions and see if I can get to that.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you 2 more questions, just so you know. So The first isn't there some sort of offset of funds? I'm sorry, some sort of offset when funds shift from emergency services to housing?
Oh my goodness. The age-old, boy, this would make so much sense, and yet there's no example in history of when we've ever been able to get government to do this. No. I mean, in theory, we save government large amounts of money. We know that, the cost of an emergency room stay is approaching $2,000 a night, and the cost of a PSH unit is $80 a night. So in theory, we save government large amounts of money when we do this. But in practice, we have not seen government, and this is what we're trying on Measure J. We're trying to move dollars from incarceration and the 40% of the people who are incarcerated but there because they have a serious mental illness. We're trying to move that over to board and care, community-based care, and the system fights back hard on moving dollars in that way. There are a lot of entrenched interests that don't want to see their budgets go down, even if their level of services needed are going down. Remains to be seen. We're also not there yet. When we get all these HHH units open, which will happen over the next 3 years, when we get these all open, that'll be a really interesting test because that will make a mark on chronic homelessness in the city of Los Angeles. It's not going to end it, but that will make a meaningful mark on it. I'll be curious to see. That's a good note for something we should do some research on, see if there's a foundation that would do this. What that means for public budgets as it relates to emergency services.
Okay, here's my last question. What can we do to help, both individually and on a policy level? What should people who care about this be doing?
Oh, so much. Like what we're doing here today. Okay, here's the LAFTA website is LA Homeless Services Authority. Is a challenge, but sometimes you get lucky and you find the homeless count youth homelessness presentation with one simple Google. So there that is in the chat if you want to read all about youth homelessness. That's old, Not that old, but it's old. Okay, so you are not this group, but historically speaking, local politics, civic advocacy, engaging at city and county government levels has not been a particularly robust exercise by Angelenos. Put another way, most people don't vote or pay attention to what's going on locally in LA. Most people don't give politically in LA. You want to know a crazy stat? Sarah will remember this from some of our Measure J conversations. We raised $3.5 million for Measure J, which is what it took, and the Sheriff's Union spent $3.5 million against us. 2/3 of that money came from zip codes in the Bay Area. Isn't that shocking? That the Bay Area paid for our housing justice, fair, not cages ballot measure? Like, that's unbelievable. And we were trying hard here. And it's just, you know, I don't quite know what it is. Like, is it a preference to focus on national politics and give to like national electeds? I think that's a piece of it. Is it a preference to focus on service providers? Sarah says yes. Is it a preference to focus on service providers and not systems or policy or politics? I think that's another part of it. I mean, especially in the entertainment industry, and I was last at LA Family Housing. The entertainment industry is amazing for LA Family Housing, but that's a service provider who helps about 8,000 people a year and doesn't do a ton of systems level advocacy, policy work, holding electeds accountable. So, like I said, you guys are not the problem here, and so I don't want to make you think that you are. But how do we create 100 groups like yours, right? Because if there was, and this is especially wonky, so I wouldn't even set the, that's a good point there. I wouldn't even want to set the expectation that we're going to be talking like this level of wonkery, because this is pretty wonky for most people. But like, how do we change that equation on who pays attention to local policy, especially the board of supervisors? I mean, if you did a poll and asked people who the 5 supervisors are, nobody knows. Nobody even knows what they are or that they exist. And yet they control $38 billion a year of all of the things we're talking about here. Like 5 people are leading the state of Michigan. So we need to do more of this, Brooke, and we need to figure out how we do more of it across the city. And we need to figure out how we translate it into political giving, squeezing electeds. Because unless we can crack that nut, then we're just going to keep being disappointed by our policies and where our dollars go.
Well, I think that was a clear and concise call to action. So, Tommy, I just want to thank you again for all your hard work and for sharing your expertise with us. It's such a gift to be able to have you join us and learn from you and get to work alongside you. And we look forward to continuing to be in this fight together with you. So thank you for taking the time out to join us this evening. I'm sure you will be hearing from us very shortly about whatever our next effort will be together. And you should know that we are also here to support the work that you guys are doing at the Everyone In campaign, because we believe in the work that you're doing and want to be in this fight alongside you. So thank you so much.
Amen. I appreciate it. And you know where to find me. I get like 100 emails a day, so I'm sorry if I'm not like right on top of it, but I do my best to make my way.
I'm persistent.
So feel free always to reach out. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Good to see y'all.
Thank you, Tommy. All right, and everyone else, please stay with us. We still have lots more good stuff to talk about this evening. I hope people found that informative and also inspiring. You know, there's a lot more good work for us to do out there, and always important to start with learning. So I want to, in a moment, I'm going to hand over the floor to Tony Gettelson, who's a member of our steering committee and one of our lay leaders. And Tony, I just want to preface by saying, has done incredible work over the last few months in taking a deep dive in researching our housing crisis and thinking hard about like what are some specific ways that we as just citizens can get involved in reshaping the highest levels of our policy in order to create the kind of city and the environment that we want to live in. And that is an environment that actually has housing for all the people who live here. And I will let Tony speak to you more about the work that he's done, but he's landed on a particular piece of policy that's in the process of being developed right now called the housing element. He'll tell you more about that. But we have an opportunity right now to get involved in both helping to pass this new policy for Los Angeles, and then in continuing to be involved as advocates, really importantly, on holding our elected officials accountable to the policy commitments that they make to build housing across our city. So I just want to say, like, tremendous gratitude to Tony from all of us who are on the steering committee, and I know from all of you too, for the work that he's been doing and for the way that he's been educating the rest of us. And so with that, Tony, take it away.
Thank you so much. And this has been so helpful to tee this up. And I hope what I'm about to talk about, and I'll talk hopefully more rapidly than I normally do to get a lot in, maybe a way forward. First, I'll start by sharing my screen. Can everybody see that? I assume you can. Am I blocking anything, or is this, oopsie, that's not what I wanted to do.
You're good, Tony.
All right. Can you hear me? I'm assuming? Yeah. So is my screen blocking this? Can you?
No, it's great.
Oh, good. Okay. So the livable communities thing, yeah, it's actually a thing. It began kind of on a parallel track with eCar, a group of us who belong to a grassroots neighborhood coalition a lot of you are aware of called Hang Out Do Good. So 20 or 30 of us got together to talk about the housing crisis, and certainly the homeless crisis, which, as Jody said, is a humanitarian disaster we see playing around us every day, trying to understand what we could do. And we had pretty intensive conversations, not only among ourselves, but then we began to talk to the experts, some academics and affordable housing developers. And yeah, and I took actually a pretty deep dive into some of the literature. And believe me, I'm not an expert, but I've learned a lot in the last 10 months. And so we hope this is sort of a holistic way forward, which I will get to. But something that Tommy and that conversation was so helpful. One thing we should understand is this problem didn't come down from the heavens. This is a result of decades of a lot of very poor policy choices and land use decisions. And as one housing expert, leader of SCAMF, actually said to me, it's a question of the city getting in its own way through zoning and really bad policies. And we can actually have a very big impact in changing that. So to begin with, how did we get here? And Tommy began to touch on it. But a good way to get into this conversation is simply to take a look at a map of LA. This is the zoning map. And among its many virtues LA has, our climate, I'm a New York kid, but it took me years to adjust to living here, is we have lots of land. LA is about 470 square miles. But the problem is all this yellow you see, 3/4 of LA is essentially zoned for single family homes. So all of this is single family homes, all the yellow. And all the brown down in here, that's our housing density. That's duplexes and triplexes, but it's also large housing complexes like Park La Brea and large buildings. And it's all concentrated down in the south and east of LA. And that's not an accident. The map of LA actually began in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s with this process that some of you are probably familiar with called redlining. And that's sort of most easily described as two things. One, the banks, in order to keep hardworking communities of color in their own neighborhoods, redlined down in here. And these were not desirable places to lend to. But up in here, in the more affluent white communities, those were desirable places to lend to. And then more insidiously, zoning was used as a tool to promote segregation. And what happened was, in order to live here, you had to build or buy a single family home with a front yard and a backyard and setbacks and side yards and a garage and all kinds of zoning rules. And as a consequence, most families of color couldn't afford to live anywhere in here. And so we resulted in it was very effective in a segregated city. So of course, the good news is redlining is now completely illegal. But the bad news is, sadly, when you look at these maps, and it's startling, the map of LA has not changed a great deal since the 1950s. And if you took a look at a couple of other maps quickly, you get a better handle on it. So this is an overcrowding or a density map of LA. And density is, or overcrowding is generally defined by the government. It's a peculiar definition. More than 1.5 people living per room. Go figure. But really, as Tommy was saying, it's multifamilies crammed into a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, or multi-generations, grandparents, parents, children, and grandchildren crammed into what could be a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. And here, where the most severe overcrowding is, no surprise, is down in here. The dark blue is severe overcrowding. And of course, in the single family homes, we don't see much overcrowding at all. So 2 more maps sort of finish this fairly bleak or pretty bleak picture. Over here on the left is over in the last 11 years, where almost all the new affordable housing has been concentrated. And no surprise, it's in the South and East, and we see very little affordable housing or housing density of any kind in these other neighborhoods. And then you jump over to the map on the right, and it tells a pretty damning story. It's a median household income tract of LA. No surprise, all the green are affluent communities. Technically, they make over $120,000 per household. But as you can imagine, just looking at the map, most of these households, or many of them, make substantially more than that. The brown, you might say, are working class, who make between $30,000 and $60,000. And that's a big basket, like a home health care worker who takes care of another human being, or could work at a living facility, makes maybe $25,000 to $30,000, as does a food prep person. That's working poor. A teacher who God knows we need might make $60,000, and that's below the average median income of LA. So it's really hard to live in LA on that, as you can imagine. But then the extreme poverty, $0 to $30,000 per year, is concentrated in here. And we could stop and we could have a meaningful talk, as Tommy started to do, about the consequences, the implications of this map. But first of all, it's morally and ethically unacceptable. Second of all, since 1954, it's both state, federal, and it's law and housing law. Separate but equal is inherently unequal. But then there's even more practical considerations. Almost every study will tell you that when people of color or under-resourced families are allowed to live in the better parts of the city, the outcome of your life is changed. Where you live determines your outcome of life. So if you live in a better neighborhood with access to jobs and better schools, more than likely your kid will end up going to college. So by fixing this map, we can actually lift LA for all of us. This is not a healthy map. This is not a healthy map for a diverse, culturally vibrant city of LA to live. Essentially, we are two separate cities, even now, even today, as culturally diverse as we are. And this also raises I'm in my own way here, but this raises sort of the central tension of the housing issue, which can single family homes and neighborhoods coexist with increased housing density? And this brings us to sort of this loaded question about the character of LA and preserving the character of LA. And it can mean 2 things. Do we mean by that, do we mean this really racially inequitable map where we have wealth and segregation and poverty concentrated down in here, and communities of color? It can also mean, and again, it took me 25 years to adjust to LA coming from New York. It is this weird suburban sprawl with a lot of density, and it's sort of geographically, it is what makes LA LA. So can we have a more equitable map with more housing density side by side with what I call our leafy neighborhoods? And our answer, after a lot of conversations, is absolutely resounding. We can, and it can actually be an opportunity to make LA a better, much more livable place. So how do we accomplish this miracle? Through the Livable Communities Initiative, which I promise I will get to very shortly. And yes, it is actually, to our vast delight and pleasure, this was adopted into the, which I will get to in a second, LA's housing element, which is our 8-year master plan, as it's the penultimate plan in there. They kind of diluted our language, but this is something we can organize around. So here is a concept that I was unaware of 10 months ago. It's called the housing element. And every 8 years, by law, as part of a city's general plan, every city in California has to come up with their housing element. This is the current draft of the housing element. I hope they'll put a better cover on it. This has been being drafted over the last year or two, because we're just beginning the 6th cycle of our housing cycle. It's 8-year cycles. So this has just been a third draft has just been approved by the Department of Planning and submitted to the City Council for review and comment. So it's not quite baked, but by mid-December, this will become the new housing element. So we have room to make improvements. And what's in the housing element? It is, as I said, it's a master plan for how are we going to house everyone in LA, and it's filled with all kinds of actually quite good, it's quite readable, feel-good talk about a fair and equitable map, solving the homeless crisis, making LA a healthier, more livable city. So you read it, your heart fills with joy, but until now, it's really been more of an aspirational document. And to get into a little bit more of the wonky nitty gritty, because it's important, part of a very critical part of the housing element is this concept, and this you should jot down or bear in mind, because it is the basis of a lot of the housing conversation, is this thing called RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. And that is essentially a demographic projection of based on income, people moving out, mortality rates, aging. We're an aging city. Of what we will need in each housing cycle. So here's a quick snapshot. In the last 8 years, it was projected we would need 82,000 new housing units, of which about 33,000 would have to be affordable. And affordable can mean many different things. And maybe if we have time later, we can get into that. It has a technical definition. But here's what's really concerning. Over the next 8 years, it is projected we're going to need almost 6 times as much housing, almost 457 units of new housing, of which 185,000 need to be affordable units. So to put this in a little perspective, actually, yes, here's a snapshot of what was built over the last 6 years, and really in the last housing cycle by income categories. And the turquoise is what was actually built, and the blue was what was projected. And it's a pretty dismal picture. Over here in the above moderate category, which is really market rate and luxury housing, LA has no problem building this. We're way ahead of what we need. But as Tommy was touching upon, in the very low and moderate income categories, we're not even coming close. And actually a good way to look at it is measure age, which absolutely is a well-intentioned and is accomplishing what it needs. But just to put into perspective the challenge that is ahead of us, this is the snapshot of what's been built or committed to, not built to date. It's about 72, there it is, 7,227 units, of which 16 have now opened, 16 developments have opened, 53 are under construction, and 41 are back in the pipeline. So now HHH is now 5 years old. And when it's done in 5 to 7 years, we might have 8,000 units. But based on the projections, in order to house just the affordable part, and I'm not too worried about the luxury market, that they take care of themselves, we need to build 23,125 units per year. So far, when we're done, we'll have maybe about 8,000 housing units out of HHH. So we have a radical challenge in front of us. We're going to have to make some radical reforms if we're going to even get close to doing this. And just 2 last thoughts on the housing element. As I said, in years past, it has been an aspirational document, a very good aspirate, but it's got written and more or less got put on the shelves, put on the shelf. But this year, as a result of SB 35 and a whole spate of other state legislation, the state is saying not just to LA, but to all the cities in California, if you don't decide where it's going to go in some equitable way, we can step in and we will tell you where it'll go. And as well, the city, in a very good move in May, came out with their equitable distribution plan, which essentially it's over here. It's saying these neighborhoods on the west side and in central LA and Valley will be getting, this is equitable, is affordable housing. We'll be getting this much affordable housing, and it'll be up to community groups and community plans to decide where this housing will go. South and East LA will get less because they've gotten a lot more in the past. So this brings me back to actually the Livable Communities Initiative and what it is. And here it is, I'm proud to say. It's the 131st program in the housing element. It's right at the very back where all the programs go. And I'll read you, we're not crazy about this language, and we hope to change it now that it's going to the City Council of Planning and Land Use. But here's the basic concept. I'll quote, a holistic concept of livable, healthy, and sustainable communities along the city's transit-rich corridors, meaning, and I'll get to this in 1 second, Pico, Olympic, Westwood, Western, Vermont, all these underdeveloped corridors, which have been underdeveloped for a very specific reason. So we would upzone those, utilizing mixed use, mixed income housing, combined with opportunities to transform the street and public realm, our neighborhoods, our communities, by adding improved wide sidewalks, tree canopies, alfresco dining, bike lanes, and fast and frequent transit. So we tried to bring a lot of concepts, and none of this is new. It's all in the housing element. These are all urban planning ideas all together into one very ambitious idea. Because right now, this is a picture of Pico Boulevard, and you're all familiar with it. What I didn't know until fairly recently, and this is before my time in LA, in 1986, voters passed Measure U. And this was a deliberate anti-growth, anti-density measure, and that's how it was marketed. And voters adopted it. It was, I think it won 2-1 back then, because we didn't want a lot of growth. As a result, Pico, Olympic, all these boulevards look like this. You do your errands and you get off the street, and they haven't been developed. And the main point of the Livable Communities Initiative is to do something like this. Is to create what we call gentle density along these corridors, mainly along the corridors where we should have density. So we're talking 3 to 5 stories, maybe 7 stories where it makes sense of what are called complete streets. And what that means is you add alfresco dining, you add trees, you widen the sidewalks, and you create this kind of environment with dedicated bike lanes connected to transit, and wide sidewalks, parklets, to create something like this with bikes. And it occurred to me, it's like this, we have this weird thing. Sorry.
Tony, we got about 1 more minute before.
Oh, we got 1 more minute. Okay. Oh, I'm almost done actually. We get in our cars and we drive to Larchmont Boulevard to shop and walk around, when in fact we should be creating these kinds of neighborhoods all over LA, which we can do. Let me see. And then it also creates what's called the 15-minute street, the 15-minute city, rather. Where you live, everything should be within a 15-minute walk or bike or bus ride to whatever you need. And Berkeley's a lot like that. So there's no reason why we couldn't make LA more of a 15-minute street, with a 15-minute city with what do you call sticky streets where you want to spend time. Here's a proposal of where it could go. We could go back to that. But the whole idea is to take this Westwood Boulevard, which would be prime for this kind of development, and turn it into something like that. But to achieve this dream will require a huge amount of organizing, because getting into the housing element is only the first stop. So I can stop there.
Thank you so much, Tony. That was amazing and really helpful. And we got a lot of good information tonight. And also, that provides us a way forward. So thank you so much, Tony. So I just want to give a quick update on some of the things that we were working. So this is kind of what Tony just gave you was looking forward. I want to look back a little bit, because I know some people are wondering about all the phone calls we made for bills and what happened last legislative cycle, because the legislative cycle kind of went along with the Jewish year cycle. So I'm going to give you guys a really quick update on that, and then I'm gonna hand it over to Stacy to close it out for us. So we in Minyan Tzedek Community Organizing supported 3 bills last legislative cycle. We spent the most time and the most of these meetings on SB 679, which you heard a little bit about before. It would have created a central funding source for affordable housing in LA. And unfortunately, it was never brought to a vote in the assembly because there was a standoff between the building trades unions and the affordable housing developers, and the politicians were too afraid to pass it. So hopefully we'll have another chance to pass something like that in the future. However, 2 other bills that we supported did pass. They were both justice system reform bills. One was the Crisis Act, which creates alternatives to calling the police when you see someone in mental health crisis. It's a pilot program for that, so we're really excited about that. And the other one was SB 2, which basically creates a licensing system for police so that police who commit misconduct can't get fired and go into other jurisdictions. So that's great. Now looking ahead, as you guys might know, ECAR is building affordable housing on the property we own for formerly homeless seniors. And currently state law allows religious institutions to eliminate up to 50% of the required parking. We talked a little bit about how expensive parking is and the problems with building affordable housing with that. So religious institutions can eliminate up to 50% of that if they want to build affordable housing. But when we went to exercise that right, we realized that that doesn't apply to us because it only applies to churches or synagogues who want to convert existing parking. It doesn't really make any sense, right? So we want to fix that. So we're partnering with LA Voice to find a friendly legislator and get a bill passed that addresses this problem so we can help these vulnerable seniors get into housing. So looking forward, we're looking at the housing element and how we can help address the housing crisis through that, and also how we as ECAR can actually help address it. So look out for more information on that coming forward. And it is now 8:30, and I need to let all of you go, but I'm going to turn it over to Stacy and Hannah to talk about next steps and a closing before we shut it down. Stacy, do you want to?
Thank you, Adam, and thank you all for being with us tonight. I see a lot of familiar faces who we've been thrilled to work with in the past, and some new faces, and we're thrilled to work with you going forward. So a couple of things, sort of building off of what Tony and Adam said, we're really focused on housing and homelessness for this year. And, you've gotten to seed this meeting of campaigns, and we're going to be calling on you to really be taking action as both with the housing element, getting the bill passed, not the bill, the housing element passed. And then also, on the other end, we're going to be, looking for ways that we can make sure it gets implemented. So that's, what we're going to be calling all of you for, and for also spreading the word within our community. And as we go forward with this potential bill, again, we're going to be calling on all of you to help us make that happen. And one of the things that we really are going to need for all of this are people who can show up during the day. And I know that's not everybody, but we're going to try and build, sort of a go-to list of people who have flexibility in their work schedules, or or time during hours when we can meet with legislators, when we can attend council meetings, things like that. So if that is you, please let us know. We'll also be sending this out over email at MT Organizing is how you get in touch with us. If somebody on the steering committee could drop that in the chat, that'd be great. So just so we can, sort of get to know, how people can help. If you're new to our group, or if you've been around for a while and are looking to get more involved, please also reach out. We'd love to do more about the work we're doing and find ways that we can kind of plug you in where, what would be a good fit for your interests. So we'd love to get to know all of you better. We all miss chatting over snacks at the beginning of meetings and as we go out the door, and love to find ways to talk to you. So please do reach out. And that's really next steps, other than we have our book group coming up on, I've written this down. Is it December 12th?
I think that's Sunday, December 12th, and we're reading Evicted. Yeah. Sunday, December 12th at 4 p.m. and we're reading Evicted by Matthew Desmond.
Thank you. Yeah. And it's been out for a couple of years, but if you haven't read it, it's really powerful and worth a reread if you have. And we'll also share some interviews or ways that you can, if you don't finish the book, and I know it always, please feel free to come and talk, and we'd love to all get together. And I don't know what's going on outside my window. So that is a perfect time for me to turn it over to Hannah to close us. And thank you again for being here.
Thanks, everybody. There's so much information and so much that we're all taking in. But just a reminder to remember that there are lots of ways to be in this work, and there are lots of moments that call us to be in it in different ways, and to just be gentle with yourselves as you navigate this moment and the intensity of so much of it, and scream when you need to scream, and quietly open your heart when that's what you need to do. And always a blessing to be with you all. Have a great night. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you soon.